QSO Today, episode 300, the panel discussion. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, the makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. On the QSO Today homepage is a menu item called Expo in the upper right corner of the screen. If you click on it, it will take you to more information about the QSO Today Virtual Ham Radio Expo. Me and my team are building out a virtual ham radio convention that includes speakers, exhibitors, prizes, and more. We are working to make attending our convention fun and realistic. I had a fantastic response from my former guests to fill the speaker slots, and George, KJ6VU from the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, is helping me to line up the speakers and to build the tracks. Stay tuned for more information. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Uthforzad1UG, your host. This is episode 300, and another milestone in the history of the QSO Today podcast. With this episode, I wanted to do something different and to bring you a panel of amateur radio operators. Most of them, or all of them, are former guests on the QSO Today podcast. What I wanted to talk to them about is what they were doing before the COVID-19 pandemic and what they're doing now. I'm joined today by George Zafiropoulos, KJ6VU, of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, Bill Meara, N2CQR, and Pete Juliano, N6QW, of the Solder Smoke podcast, Ashhar Farhan, VU2ESE, creator of the BitX HF transceiver, and Hans Summers, G0UPL, founder of QRP Labs, the creator of the QCX HF transceiver kit, and sponsor of the QSO Today podcast. We're doing this in roundtable on Zoom, and with luck and the expertise of Ben Bretsky, you're watching it now on YouTube. I want to thank you all for joining me for episode 300 of the QSO Today podcast. With all of your help, I got here today. I wrote on the newsletter that went out this morning that I also passed 1 million downloads of the QSO Today podcast. Now, Tim Ferriss has 1.5 million downloads a week or something like that. But for the little QSO Today podcast, 1 million downloads in almost 6 years isn't too bad. So I appreciate all of you for coming and for contributing to that over the last almost 6 years. So with that, I thought that we'd get all together and we would talk about what we're working on. All of you are project guys. It was a deliberate thing on my part to get people who do projects because I do projects and I relate well to people who are project guys. What I thought I'd do is I'd open up the conversation and maybe use some terms, define some terms up front. So the terms I'm defining up front is BC, before Corona, or before COVID-19, and AC, after Corona. And what I'm interested in is what we were doing before and what we're doing now, and if it hasn't changed very much, why hasn't it? I'm interested in things in terms of how we are feeding our projects AC, whether we still have supply chain access, whether we're venturing out. Today is the first time in 4 weeks I actually was able to leave the house in a car and go someplace. There's a certain amount of liberation in that on the one hand. So I think that's where we'll go. And so I think maybe what we'll do is we'll go to the farthest time zone from California. Say, Ashhar, Farhan, what were you doing? You're the creator of the BitX. The BitX has morphed into a big project. What are you doing before and what's happening now?
I was actually trying to learn software-defined radios, mostly inspired by the kind of work that Hans has been doing. And I had struck a friendship with Phil Karn, Kilo Alpha 9 Queen. Phil Karn is known to many of us. We used our internet Karn.exe to dial into the nets, internets long time ago. So he put me onto a couple of things, and what I was building was actually something more to learn than anything else, which is to convert everything to frequency domain. And, you get the waterfall, and then you just slice the signals off the waterfall in frequency domain. So do an SDR in frequency domain. It's very interesting, very intuitive. I was half done with that when Corona struck. And we knew that it was coming, but by mid-March, it was more or less certain that we'd go into lockdown. So actually, my family went into a lockdown a week before the government announced the lockdown. So it's interesting of what we did for the long lockdown, which is we ran and got everything done, including I got my computers repaired and I stocked up with some components as well, because I knew that this was going to be, a long haul. So actually, maybe, I should show you this. I have a sort of a, okay, let's come back in a minute. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see this, but I actually have almost a complete store of components here, stocked up a little on that. But what happened after that is actually even more interesting. So Gordon Gibby is a radio ham from University of Florida. I always forget his call sign. He's a Bitex builder. And he reached out. He said that, they are a bunch of doctors who are trying to build an open source ventilator. And if I could pitch in there, then I jumped right in. So that's actually what I've been doing, working on the software and some parts of the hardware of the ventilator. And we're just homebrewing the entire stuff out. So we'll talk about that in a bit, but that's what's kept me busy. Did that, then also did a website to connect people who've got food with people who do not have food. So, you sort of mix and match them on a map, saying, I'm here and around me, how many people are there who are homeless or don't have food for the night or shelter, etc. So we've been working with that. So I just got immersed in the relief work. And that's actually what's keeping me busy, very busy, in fact, pulling about 20-hour days right now.
And this relief work that you're doing, this is all being done at home. All the work that you're doing is being in place, not leaving your house.
Well, I really wish I could move out. And, I have age on my side. I'm still in my 50s. I could have gone out, but I live with my parents. My dad is 90 years old and my mom is in her mid-80s. So I can't afford to bring infection back home. And, we have a sort of a pod here. So we are about almost 11 people here actually at home. My domestic help, she and her family have also moved in with us. So we are a full house here. So, it's very difficult for us and extremely risky for me to get out right now.
And we were talking a little bit earlier that the numbers that are stated in terms of the amount of infection may be understated in India, maybe because of lack of testing.
Yeah, we're testing 1 in a million right now, which is really horrible.
And India is over 1 billion people.
Yeah, so you can just imagine that the testing is really, really down, and I hope it improves. We don't have enough kits. We don't even have PPE. We don't have. Hospital beds are a long way off. So actually, and we did the lockdown a little too late. I guess we should have locked ourselves down by 1st of March or something, when the cases were inside 100. We locked ourselves down when the cases were about 3,000 reported cases. But that's life. We have to go on from this point on. But what has happened in India is, because there's no social security, there is no healthcare. The lockdown was done within 4 hours, so people didn't have time to stock. And many people didn't even have money to stock up. They were all daily wage earners. About 80% of Indians eat what they earn on that particular day. So, they don't have any savings at all. So that's actually made it into a huge humanitarian disaster right now.
If we go to the other end of the world, George, I think you're the farthest west from us. I think California was one of the first to lock down in all the 50 states of the United States. What's happening there? What were you doing before BC, and what's changed?
Well, we have been on lockdown for about a month now, and the Bay Area, the counties in the Bay Area moved pretty quickly to do that unilaterally, and then the state of California did it about at the same time, I think a day off. So things moved pretty quickly around here, and I would say for folks in the Bay Area, like myself, if you work in the high-tech world, this is really, frankly, no big deal, because a lot of us are in my normal daily work life. I'm on the phone. I'm doing video calls with people all over the world anyway. So I could do that at the office. I could do that at home. I could do that just about anywhere. So for me, the impact has really been negligible. But it's really tough for anybody who has a regular job where you have to be out, in the real world interacting with people. So that's really tough. I think that's really the hard part is, all the people who are not fortunate enough to be able to do this. So anyway, here things are fairly well under control. We are supposed to stay at home. You can go to the grocery store, you can go to the hardware store, that sort of thing, but you really aren't able to go out to eat. You can't go to the movie theater and any of that sort of thing. So it's pretty well controlled. For me personally, on the ham radio front, since I haven't been able to travel for work and I haven't been burning an hour and a half a day commuting to the office, that's sort of freed up some time, much of which is eaten up by more meetings at work. So I'm not sure how much that I get back. But what it has made me do is as I sit here at my home office desk and I'm on calls at work, I look around and think, boy, I really need to clean this wiring up. Or, I really need to fix that radio. So it has given me some motivation to clean up the shack and neaten things up. I recently had to reinstall all my antennas because we did a bunch of roof work. So I had to put in new coax and new antennas and all that stuff. And so I've got some projects to make the operation of the station more efficient with some remotely controlled antenna relays and some audio mixers and stuff like that. So I think that the biggest thing for me in the ham world is really having time to focus on getting the shack kind of whipped into shape. I did also get a chance to finally try out FT8 and JSA call. And it's not for lack of interest. I just hadn't had the time, but I took the 10 minutes it required to actually install the software. It turns out it's surprisingly easy, and was able to make a bunch of contacts on those two modes. And that was really fun. It was actually a lot more fun than I thought it would be. So everybody keeps dissing on FT8, and I don't know why, because I think it's a pretty incredible mode. It's the perfect mode for people who don't really like to talk to each other. And are otherwise doing their email, but still make a contact, because you can reach over and with the click of a button have a QSO, or at least the computer is having a QSO with somebody else, and you can see if you actually completed the contact. So that's pretty much it. And I'm kind of looking forward to actually finally having the shack functional and working well. I did buy boxes of ferrites and have been choking the heck out of every cable in this place. So I'm trying to eliminate any and all RFI interference. So Bob at Palomar Engineering is my new best friend, because they have everything you need, and he's a fount of knowledge. So that's been super educational.
And he appreciates having your credit card number for shipping ferrites.
Yeah, he's on speed dial now.
Pete Juliano, you're in your garage there in Southern California, is that right?
Yeah, my garage shack.
Now, it's my understanding that listening to the Solder Smoke podcast, there's always a project on your bench. What was the project on your bench, and has anything changed for you?
Well, it has, and it's interesting to see. First of kind of a data point from Southern California, you get on the freeways and they're empty. And the other problem is people are going 100 miles an hour because they're empty. And they see that as a real problem. Once the freeways get filled back up again, people are going to have a tough time keeping their foot off the accelerator. But I mean, the highway patrol is not doing much to stop anything, but it's empty. And it's really noticeable in the area I live in. Of course, there's a lot of people that commute to Los Angeles and what have you, and the streets are empty at 7 o'clock in the morning. And normally it was bumper to bumper.
Wow.
But it's also, I think, a good opportunity to fix some things. I've had some software that had some, controlling some projects. And so you say, okay, now's the time to fix it. And I've fixed it. I've done another thing, too, is since parts are kind of starting to get hard to get. Well, actually, they're not hard to get. It's just they got delivery times that look out into June and July, which is unbelievable. Before it used to be like few days away or a week away, you get some pretty common parts, and now the lead times are going. I mean, they're still selling them, but it's just not available. So I forced myself to look around the shack if I'm taking on some projects. What have I got here? What's here available that I can make do? And I think all of us are looking at that. And then currently on the bench is I'm trying to build a hardware phasing transmitter. And a lot of that involves some external investigations of how do you do the phasing technique and what's the best way to do it? And you certainly learn a lot. So it's something I've never built before. I built a lot of filter rigs, but never built really a phasing transmitter or transceiver, other than maybe some of the stuff that you've worked on with software-defined radios, where the software is doing the heavy lifting. Now it's got to be hardware. So that's what's on the bench right now. And in many respects, I think it's also I've been listening on the air. Now, yesterday, I understand, was International Ham Radio Day, which they were encouraging everybody to get on the air. Well, I tune on 40 meters, and I didn't hear much. So I guess that the advance notice of that coming just didn't happen. But 40, for his number of people that are home, you would think 40 meters would be pretty active. And you hear a bit of activity around between 5 and 7 o'clock at night. But during the day, you don't hear too much. A few of the nets heavy. But right now, the focus is working on the hardware phasing transmitter.
Well, so I'm going to refer you to episode 298 of the QSO Today podcast, where Paul Taylor, VK3HN, I think is working on a hardware phasing transmitter. He might be the guy to look up. Okay, well, I'm wondering, because I've actually heard of issues with the supply chain. We can talk to Hans in just a second. He could tell us whether there's supply chain issues right now. But what do you think, Pete, in an area like Southern California that has thousands of hams being able to open up their junk boxes or their supplies in order to be able to balance the supply chain for ham radio projects? That's a strange question.
No, I think absolutely. That's an absolute good question. And I've already done that. A couple of guys said, gee, I'm missing this. And the mail system still works, so you can mail them some parts. And we're lack of just a few parts. In some cases, we'll let someone complete a project. By the way, Hans, I did get my 2 polyphase networks. They did arrive from Turkey, so just let you know I got them, and that's next in the step there. Just wanted to let you know that.
Well, I think we can go over to Hans, because Hans is, I think, one of the people that probably depends upon the supply chain more than anybody else. Maybe Bill. Although it looks like Bill has a lot of stuff in the background there, in the garage there, in order to keep the projects going.
Most of it was sent to me by Pete.
There you go. Hans, what's happening out in your corner of the world?
Well, from a personal hobby projects perspective, I would have a lifetime supply of junk to make my homebrew projects. So there's no issue there. But, as you know, I run QRP Labs, and we are very heavily dependent on supply chain. The timing of this whole pandemic was somewhat fortunate to us because it coincided with Chinese New Year. I get PCBs made in China, and so every time Chinese New Year comes around, I have a big panic a couple of months beforehand and look at anything that might run out in the next 3 months and make sure I have tons of stock of it. And so I had anyway ordered a lot of things ahead of Chinese New Year. And so we had plenty of stuff in stock in any case. But here in Turkey, the lockdown has been in place for about a month. It was done very, very quickly. Turkey found its first case, and pretty much the next day they announced that everything was closing, and the schools were closing from that following day. And so it's been, I think, about a month now, if I'm counting correctly. It's not a total lockdown. The over 65s are not allowed out now, and the under 20s. And the rest of the people are allowed to go to work and continue doing everything they would normally do. But restaurants are closed, bars, cafes, cinemas, shopping centre. Pretty much the only stuff that's open is supermarkets and banks, post office, this kind of thing. So it's very, very quiet. But really the mail delivery service is still in operation. And so we have been able continuously throughout to continue shipping out packages to customers because the post office has been open continuously so far. And from the perspective of ordering, I use some distributors, component distributors in Turkey, and they're all still operational as well. So we haven't had any problems getting parts that we need. So there hasn't been any problem there. From the project's perspective, well, that's a tricky one. My main project here that everybody's been waiting for is the QSX, the all-band, all-mode transceiver that is very, very far overdue. And this project has, it's more than a year overdue now compared to when I thought it would be ready. And it's caused me a tremendous amount of stress, the pressure of people, everybody wanting it, waiting for it, and emailing me about when is it going to be ready. And also the realization that with so many people watching, it really has to be perfect and correct and working as it should be from day one. There can't afford to be any big mistakes. So I kind of swore to myself that I wouldn't tell anybody what new products I'm working on in the meantime. I'll never again make any public announcement until the kits are ready and in the shop and ready to ship out. So I have been working on a few things in the meantime, and in their way, each of them has also contributed to the QSX project. So there was a 50-watt power amplifier kit that we released in November, and the transmit receive switching is all solid state, and that was all things that were useful for the QSX development as well. So I kind of think these things, it's better to work on something, even if it's not exactly QSX, and make the progress in parallel. I find if I force myself too hard to 100% focus on one particular thing, that gets very stressful and productivity goes way, way down. It's quite a creative process, and I don't think you can easily, I can't anyway, be very creative when I'm under a lot of pressure. So I'm letting it come as it comes, and it will get done, and it'll be worth waiting for. And in the meantime, trying to work on a few other things to keep things going. Throughout this whole pandemic, we haven't had any issue with supply chain. We have roughly the same number of sales as we did before. There was a dip about a month ago, and quite a severe dip. But around about the same time, we actually made a deal with FedEx and TNT, which are now the same company. We've got a corporate shipping deal with FedEx, where we can ship everything anywhere in the world in 3 or 4 business days, and it only costs a few dollars extra compared to the post office. So we now offer that option on the website, and I think a lot of people appreciated being able to get things quickly. So the drop in business was kind of balanced with an increase in business because we were able to ship things more quickly, and I think that kind of they cancelled each other out. So business is just busy as usual. I can't remember the last time I worked on any hobby project. Unfortunately, I spend my entire waking hours worrying about QRP Labs emails, who has what problems, and try and squeeze out some time to actually do new product development from all of that. So there are no hobby projects on the bench. It's all just QRP Labs stuff, and we've been very busy. At the same time, I call this period my anti-isolation, because I'm ordinarily isolated. I sit here in my home office, and it's very quiet, very peaceful. We do have one employee here who handles the shipping and packing, but I get opportunity to concentrate all day long. But now my wife is home all day because nobody can go anywhere and everything is closed, and my kids, who are 4 years old and 6-year-old, are home from school all day. And so there's all this chaos and noise and interruptions. So for me, this is like an anti-isolation, and my normal is isolation, and now I've lost that. So it makes the available time even less, and it makes it harder to get everything done. So even less time to even think about having time to do any hobby projects. But so really nothing exciting from here. It's AC and BC are pretty much the same, and pandemic life is the same as BC life, and apart from having even less time because of all the interruptions and noise and chaos that's around. So nothing really exciting here, I'm afraid. It's all same as here, Eric.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get outside and be active with ICOM's new IC705 HF to UHF portable transceiver and its optional multifunction backpack. This is ICOM's perfect solution for SOTA and parks on the air. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion with its base station features and functionality at the tips of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds. This beautiful new rig has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz, and includes a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with a live band scope and waterfall display. The ICOM IC705 will be the replacement and amazing 21st century baseband rig for microwave DXers, rovers, and contesters, and the operating choice for those under the new S-HAIL geosynchronous satellite footprint. Unbelievable. The radio is 5 watts with its internal battery and 10 watts with an external 13.8 volt power supply. This full-featured radio operates on single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Included in this package is a micro USB connector, Bluetooth to support linking to your smartphone or Bluetooth headset, built-in Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone, which is standard equipment. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with plenty of room for antennas, cables, and other gear to get you on the air from the mountaintop or the local park. There is a link to this amazing new rig on the QSO Today podcast website for this episode, and when you order your new ICOM IC705 from your favorite ham radio dealer, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. I've been telling people on the podcast that amateur radio operators are experts at social distancing. We've been doing it for 100 years. There's an opportunity for us to be able to not only to say that we're the original social network, but we're also probably the original social distancers.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm a good example of that, I think. I also just wanted to mention one thing, George, pick up on one thing George mentioned, because about a week ago, I had my first FT8 contact. I was testing out some product development here and had opportunity to try out the FT8 a bit. And it was the first time I had tried it, and was somewhat skeptical. But I think, my opinion of it, because it is a controversial thing, and some people hate it, some people love it. I think probably isn't all that much different from many CW QSOs, which is the normal mode I operate. Where they're also transferring very minimal information, and the QSOs follow a very predefined format. I found FT8, I think, a little bit like a computer game for hams. You click on and you try and work these guys, and some guys are worth more than others because you haven't worked that country before, and you think, I want to collect a new country, and or further distance, or special event call signs, and kind of. I can't see myself really being into it long term, but it was fun to play with and a bit of a challenge, and good testing the equipment here.
So what do you think about that, George? Do you have a response?
I was just sort of laughing to myself because when you said it's kind of like a game for hams, that's exactly right. Because when the stations come up, you see the call signs of all the stations, and in every time I would make a contact, I'm looking at what's the best DX station of the bunch and try for that one. So it's exactly a game, sort of gamified experience. And like you said, Hans, when I think about most CW contacts, if you're not a CW rag chewer, every QSO looks the same. It's RST, location, name, rig, 73, and that's almost exactly what you wind up doing with FT8. So,
well, a lot of the time you don't even get the rig, and you don't get the QTH. Right. Sometimes you get even less information.
Yeah, exactly.
And you've got to be quick with FT8 as well. When you see those new stations come up, you've only got 1 or 2 seconds to click on the one you want, and it's kind of fun and challenging. But I'll be back on CW, I think.
I'm anxious to try FT8, but I'm waiting for the mode. I'm waiting for someone to write software that I can turn it on and it runs back here, and then I can do my other thing, and it just, it makes contacts for me, and I don't have to pay attention to it, so I can do the stuff that's on this side of the desk. I might have to wait for that, or maybe Whisper is more like that mode than an automated FT8. Bill Meara, it's so good to see you, to see what's going on in your garage. What was going on in BC?
Well, BC and before the crisis and after Corona, I mean, for me personally, not a lot changed. And I think that I'm similar in situation to Hans and maybe to George a bit, Pete. I retired at the end of September. And so I had gotten used to kind of staying at home and being in the neighborhood. And at midday, there's not a lot of people around. So if I go out and take a walk or take a bike ride, I was pretty much by myself. But now it's almost as if everyone has joined me out here, in the suburbs, 9 miles to the west of the nation's capital. And so, I mean, it actually seems more lively to me than it was before. Now, that's against a very, very serious backdrop. I mean, I'm from New York City, so we've been watching closely the catastrophe unfold in my hometown, and it's quite sobering. Also, it's had a big impact. It hasn't had much of an impact on me, but people very close to us have been hit very hard. Even at a minimal level, my kids, basically college ended for them on spring break, which was quite a shock. I mean, their life was completely upended. They came home for spring break. They got text messages saying, don't come back. And in the case of my son, who's a senior, that means don't come back at all. So it's for them, this was quite a shock. And I've had to keep in mind the fact that they're suffering a much greater change than I suffered. Also, Pete and I have talked about this. I served in Italy and in Spain and have close friends there. And so the reports that you get back from northern Italy and from the northern regions of Spain, it's really horrendous. So it's very serious stuff. I guess the only thing I've been doing to contribute is encouraging people to do what they're supposed to do. And Pete and I have been doing that through the podcast. We jokingly develop a lot of acronyms on the Solder Smoke podcast over the years, and we came up with one for this situation. It's called SITS, Stay in the Shack. As Eric was saying, we're good at social isolation because, well, we're kind of introverts. And a lot of us got into ham radio because we were, socially awkward as teenagers, and ham radio was a way to interact with people without, interacting with people. So we're good at that. But one of the things I did was I was looking for a project. I had a project in mind. And when the crisis hit, I decided to turn it into a quarantine project. And I call it the Q31. It's right back there. That's it. I finished it today. It's been 15 days. I checked. I started on April 4th. And what it is, it's a superhet receiver. I was going to build only with parts on hand, and this gets to the parts availability thing. It was almost sort of like an emergency project. You only can use the parts that you have in the shack. So that's what I did. And it is a shortwave AM receiver, all analog, for the 31-meter shortwave broadcast band. Now, I know some of you guys are wondering, why did I build something that's not for the ham bands? Well, I've actually been getting more and more interested going back to shortwave listening. I have the S38 sitting here. And before the crisis, I was working on S38s. Pete is having an emotional reaction at this point. He loves the receiver so much. He's overwhelmed. But I started listening to shortwave broadcasts. And we were talking about this a little at the start. I guess it's a sad statement, but I found that it's more pleasant to listen to shortwave broadcasts, limited as they are now, than it is to just turn on 40 meters or 75 meters and listen to the chatter there. I found that not to be very pleasant. It's actually quite aggravating sometimes. Some of the things that you hear if you're just listening to sign bad contacts on the ham bands. So anyway, I've sort of built this receiver. It's got a 455 kCIF, and it's a very simple single conversion analog VFO receiver. It works quite well. I got it working yesterday, really for the first time, quite well. I put it all in the box. Now, what I've been doing, the way this is related to the crisis, is that I've kind of increased my output of videos, and it's very easy. I'll do one each morning. The whole process will take maybe 5 minutes. I'll turn on the phone. I'll talk about what I did, talk, finish, go to the YouTube icon, upload, put a subject line on it, boom, it's done. The whole thing is done in 5 minutes. I've got, I think, 13 or 14 episodes on this there, and people are enjoying it. They're learning from it. And so I think that's one way we've responded. Pete and I have responded also on the Solder Smoke podcast by trying to increase the number of podcasts that we're doing. We had been doing about one a month. Now we're trying to do two a month or more, just because we think that this gives people something else to do while they're sitting in the shack. But that's what I've been working on. As I was finishing up this project, it's almost like when you're finishing up a book that you like and you think, damn, it's over. I wish it wasn't over. I wish I had gone more slowly, but now I'm going to have to think of something else to do. But by the way, I want to say one of the great pleasures of this project, the Q31, is that when I look at it, as I was going through it, I'm using parts, a lot of parts from Pete. The big capacitor you see sitting there is something that Pete plucked out of a Galaxy 5 transceiver, which I understand was a real dangerous beast a while back. But I got the capacitor and I kept it there. There are toroids in there that Farhan left when he visited here a couple of years ago. Those were the toroids, the trifiller wound toroids. I think that the ladies wound for you in India. Farhan left me a bunch of them, and those were the toroids that I used at either end of the diode ring mixer. I used some of the pads that Pete had left. They became the kind of the basis for the diode ring. Inspiration from Paul, VK3HN, who recently did an AM receiver project. Eric, you mentioned Paul, and of course I have to say a lot of inspiration over the years from Hans. His website is something that I find myself going back to time and again, and I know that some of his ideas worked their way in there. And finally, the other two, Eric and George, so many ideas from the podcasts. I told George that I was back in January. It seems like a million years ago. We talked about before Corona. But in January, my family and I were in a van riding literally across the island of Hispaniola, across the Dominican Republic. And I had on my phone the George's podcast, and I was listening to it, and I had a great time. It was a time he was talking about restoring old Collins gear. And I just loved it. It was great. And Eric, so many of your the QSO Todays have provided inspirational, especially the recent ones where you've had some really good homebrew guys on, and it's been very, very inspirational. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here with all of you. And Eric, I thank you for the invitation.
I got to add a comment to that, Bill. So a lot of the episodes we're doing tend to be very microcontroller centric and SDR, and we're very much about like the latest thing. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do some of the episodes on older radios was really getting inspiration from you guys, because talking about the Drake 2B, which has kind of a warm spot in my heart. My first radio was an R4B. And my best friend had a 2B, and anyway, we always like compared receivers. So anyway, listening to you guys talk about the older radios, it really clicked in my mind that we're completely missing that, and so that's why I wanted to get the Collins guy on there, and my friend Dennis, and we definitely have plans for more of that sort of thing. So it was very inspirational from you guys to open our eyes about, hey, why don't you try something old instead of something like new? And we got a really good response on that. So thanks for the thought.
They say that you're as good as the 5 people that you're hanging out with. And I'm telling you tonight in episode 300, I'm hanging out with 5 of the best. And I really appreciate that you're here. What I'd like to do now is I could talk a little bit about what I was doing. I wish it was more ham radio operation. It seems to be that most of my ham radio is the QSO Today podcast, but that's okay. Every time I think I'm going to stop, I keep going. I actually had started a project called The Great American Songbook, and I was actually getting singers to sing the songs that were written from the 30s all the way through the 70s. And so I put together these concerts, and then all of the concert venues closed. So I'm sitting right now amongst about 10,000 shekels worth of sound equipment and mixers and speakers and microphone stands and all that stuff, hoping that at some point there'll actually be a live venue for that. As a result of coronavirus, of AC, I'm hearing that all these ham radio conventions are closing. The biggest one is Dayton. I actually had thought go to Dayton this year. I got together with a friend of mine and I said, you know what could we do? And so we've decided that we're going to launch a virtual convention using some of the software platforms that are now available to kind of make it seem like you're actually walking into a convention center and going to lectures and stuff. So that's my project right now. It's become my full-time job in addition to the QSO Today podcast. I have some other work I'm supposed to do as well. I actually don't have a problem social distancing. I've been doing it for the last 60 years. You're laughing. My wife is going crazy. She's got cabin fever. I've worked at home for a number of years now, and I said, the secret is you have to get up every morning. You have to shower and shave like you're going to work. Your rituals along the day are so important as a way to keep yourself within a structure that keeps you from going crazy. What I've discovered, and I wrote this in my message today, is that people are at home, working from home. There's no structure around it. My wife's a teacher. She's taking meetings at 10 o'clock at night with teachers and people that she works with. She's meeting with students. Her work day is 18 hours long because she's unable to define the borders of what's business and what's pleasure, what's business and what's personal. How is that working for you guys?
I think it's important, Eric. I think you're right. You have to have this kind of structure. And I kind of learned that before the crisis. I learned that after retirement. You do have to set up kind of I have to watch out because I can't spend the whole day here in the shack. That just doesn't work. So I try to approximate the time in the shack that I had before retirement, maybe a little bit more because I'm retired, but I don't spend the whole day here. I have a home office that I go to and I work on other things. So it's important to have kind of a bit of variety in your life. We have shifted to Zoom. I was doing volunteer work, teaching English to immigrants here in Northern Virginia. And that all came to a screeching halt when the crisis hit. But we quickly shifted to Zoom. And even these recently arrived immigrants without a lot of resources, they have phones and they can Zoom in on the phone. So the class that we were running continues to run on Zoom. But we've sort of followed the same daily schedule that we had before. And I have resisted. Sometimes I'll get people from the volunteer center saying, well, let's have a meetup at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning or something. And I'll say, no, when I was working, I wouldn't do that. That's the weekend. We're off then. Okay. We gotta stick to a kind of a normal schedule. It helps. So I think you're right about that. No, you got to get ready for work. Yeah.
Ashhar, you have an unusual project that you've taken on that you alluded to at the beginning, and anybody that's been following you on YouTube knows about it. But why don't you talk a little bit about that and how that's going and where that's going?
Well, what happened was that Gordon reached out from the BITX group and said that we are going to get this stuff going. Would you like to help? And he thought that we could modify the digital controller of our BITX transceivers, which is called the Radiono, which has got an Arduino on it, and it's got a display to work the ventilator. But eventually, as it happened that, we ended up designing a completely new circuit board for it because it had different things. And as a side product to that, I didn't have hardware to work on, right? I was just doing the software. So I actually designed a ventilator out of a vacuum cleaner, right? So it's actually pretty simple. Probably I can, So this actually is most of it. It's just it's just plumbing, right? And this is a plumbing stuff that I found, at home. There's a pressure sensor here, which is connected to the Arduino. I'm just describing it in detail because some of your viewers may not be able to see this. And what happens is that there's a T, plumbing T, into which the pressure sensor is attached. And on one end, you connect a vacuum cleaner, and at the other end, you connect it to the patient. And the vacuum cleaner is switched on and off, and you essentially measure the pressure here. So the circuit is actually pretty simple, that there's a feedback loop here. But now, what we are also doing with that is we're having two pressure sensors, and this is the stuff that I learned in the last last 15 days. So when the same volume of air passes through pipes of different diameters, the pressure naturally changes, right? Because you're trying to move the same number of molecules. So by measuring the difference in the pressures, you know how much of air has gone in one direction. That's also something to be done. So we did that, and once we finished that, then I actually built that into a whole, a boxed stuff, and it's actually gone to the USDA. So, that's actually, I'm just holding this up. 6 of you can see this. So it has a number of features. It can work with a stepper motor for, compressing the ambu bags, or it can work with a vacuum cleaner kind of a thing. But what most of the people will use it for is that you use these plumbing sprinkler valves, right? Sprinkler solenoid valves. It's just a pipe with a solenoid in between, which can, turn the pressure on and off to regulate the oxygen, which is, coming from the piped oxygen, which is available in all the hospitals. So you switch that on and off to the patient. So it's interesting work. We are, almost at the last leg of it. The US FDA will be looking at it very shortly. And the details are there on the University of Florida's website. So it's exciting work. I've learned a lot about the mechanical part, which I'm really inept at, quite inept. My 3D printer, which I had assembled some time ago, that also went kaput. But the good thing is this, and this is what I realized, that, we radio hams are hoarders. We hoard all kinds of stuff. So in spite of the lockdown, there's almost nothing which I didn't have. I had stepper motors, I had pressure sensors. Why would I have a pressure sensor? I have no idea, but I had 3 pressure sensors, which I had picked up. Almost anything that you could think of is here in my shack. And actually, my shack is also my office, home office. This is the only office I have. I have a couple of very small, businesses and organizations that I work with, but I work out of here. So the productivity is at all-time high for me. This is it's been a very productive time. And I actually, one of the other things which did happen to me in the course of this is that I have been having long conversations with a lot of radio hams, even off air. On air, of course. My CW skills have really gone up. Afternoons, we have a CW net that I take part in. But I've been having fairly long conversations, and I've been learning a lot of theory in the meantime. I've upped my skills on noise measurements. I have upped my skills on low distortion amplifiers, which I will, very soon put to use and build stuff. But right now, I'm just waiting for the ventilator to sort of ship out. And there is the other very interesting thing, which is for it to be certified, someone has to manufacture this. And they have never encountered an open source design to be certified. They usually certify a manufacturing process. They do not certify just a design. So the US FDA itself is, going back and forth saying, how can we do that? How do we know how they're going to make it? And still, it might be dangerous if they leave a wire hanging, which is true. But that's the nature of the game. So it's really a very innovative time for a lot of us.
Do you think as amateur radio operators, are we trained and or wired to be able to solve problems outside of the purview of amateur radio? Do you think that we're kind of uniquely qualified as a result of our growing up and training in amateur radio that makes us have an ability to do something like build a respirator out of the junk parts in your... You're smiling, George. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's 2 ways to look at that. I think that for a lot of us, especially, hams who like to build stuff, that ham radio gives us an opportunity to learn a ton of things and be around other people who know a lot of things they could teach you, especially as like a young ham. There's so many guys I remember who were older than I was, who were hams, who were doing you would go build a repeater. And, from my point of view, it's all about the radio, but these guys were, putting in conduit and pulling electrical cables and pouring a foundation and putting up an antenna tower and like all this mechanical stuff that I knew nothing about. And just being around people who have that, let's just go get it done kind of an attitude kind of instills that confidence. You may have no knowledge of how to do any of that stuff, but if you surround yourself with people who are like doers, then that kind of rubs off. So I think it reinforces that, but also I think a lot of people who get into this are inherently curious and want to understand these things anyway. So I think we kind of come to the game with sort of that desire without any actual knowledge, and then it sort of is a self-reinforcing process. So yeah, I mean, a lot of guys who I know, a lot of hams are certainly some of the most resourceful people that I've ever met, who could go to a field day and have it get blown up by bad weather. You'll get very creative. Or look at the guys who do these crazy de-expeditions. You go sit on a rock in the middle of the ocean somewhere and building a platform on a rock and spend 2 weeks doing that is just, that's not radio. That's a whole nother set of skills and abilities. So,
I would agree. I'd say, I think we see on the screen right here great examples of people who are able to do that. I am constantly amazed by the things that Pete Juliano comes up with when we're talking on the podcast. We'll mention some really off-the-wall topic that's only very tenuously related to ham radio, and Pete will reach back and come up with a solution or an idea or an angle on it that I hadn't thought about or that nobody in the discussions talked about. That happens almost every episode. Farhan, when you see Farhan, taking on the ventilator project, and very quickly being able to come up with the boards to run the ventilator. I think that's a really excellent example. And Hans, Farhan and I were talking, and Hans has this, I think, insatiable curiosity, and he will dig in and become, as Farhan put it, the leading expert on a topic that no one else has really gotten into that much, and turn it into something useful. And now, we're the world awaits the QSX.
We're not pressing too hard.
Yeah.
I'm
not
saying,
feeling any pressure in this.
No. Hans, let them wait, because the same folks will be crying and moaning if it's not absolutely perfect. So I think you're absolutely right in getting it and making them wait. But I would just answer in the affirmative to Eric's question that we have some real innovators right here on the panel today.
But I think there's something about ham radio. Wouldn't you agree, Pete, that there's something about ham radio that kind of puts us in the mindset of being able to solve these problems?
I was just thinking here a little bit that I think the wiring as such gives us a baseline. I think if you're a ham and like to tinker, that's the baseline. But I was thinking back that my work experience and what I did for a living has helped me improve my skills, because so much of what I did was process-based. In other words, you have to define the process, you have to understand the elements. And I guess I keep telling myself the last thing you do is turn on the soldering iron. So many guys that like to deal with the projects, the first thing you do is to turn on the soldering iron, start connecting wires together. But I think the basic wiring gives you that inquisitive approach to things. But I think also you have to have a process. You have to be thinking about, how am I going to do this? What are the results? That especially is critical when something doesn't work. You turn it on and it smokes. So how do I get to the end state to get that problem fixed? And it has to be a process. And things I learned in industry, like fault tree analysis. I keep saying fault tree analysis, and people just think I'm weird. But it starts with something, and you have to work your way.
Pete, it sounds like you're saying poultry analysis.
Yeah, fault tree. Fault. Where's the fault? This fault, this caused this, that caused that. Fault tree analysis. Yeah. So this way, and the other thing I think is important is so many times you need to think about design for manufacturing and assembly. I keep thinking about that really cool sports car. To change the oil filter, you had to drop the engine. It was great as long as you didn't have to change the oil. But so many times in the projects, I keep thinking that in the back of my mind. Now, if I have to fix this thing, can I get to it? Which is an issue. So I think there's a basic wiring amongst hams, but then I think, at least from my perspective, having a process focus lets you do things. Like, for instance, when I build something like a transceiver, I always start with the audio amplifier, make sure that's working, and then work my way forward. So, but I mean, it's all just what I look at personally. But I think there is something wired to hams that cause the innovation. I keep thinking about a lot of the technology that we're seeing today got started by hams. I mean, you think about the software-defined radios, and I think of Gerald Youngblood and said, "Got an idea," and next thing you know, I think George has. You said you have a flex. Well, you have that flex because someone had an idea and followed up on it. And
yeah, all started with a QEX article.
Now that's become the standard, essentially.
What do you think, Hans?
I agree with everything the other people here have said. And I think in my career, and I was working in IT, in investment banking, and there are many occasions that I can relate back to where I did things in a little bit different way to how anybody else would have conventionally solved a problem. And often that led to a quicker solution or a better solution, or very often a cheaper solution. And whether these skills come about because of interest in ham radio, or whether we're interested in ham radio because we have that curiosity, I think is an interesting question. But absolutely. And I mean, ham radio is such a broad interest with so many different niches that you can get into, and the weak signal modes, digital, satellite, and contesting, DX, so many different things that you could get into. And it's really a ideal opportunity for a curious person, a curious mind, to give their mind fuel to work on, fuel to investigate things. So I think it probably attracts people with that type of mindset anyway, and that's why we find ourselves able to solve these types of problems that are not really even related to ham radio. By the way, I have to disagree with you guys about the pajamas. I'm sorry, I have to, because I've spent 22 years in investment banks, nearly all of that wearing a suit and a tie, hardly being able to breathe like this with a tie on. And I think I have a right now to work in my pajamas. And for the last 4 years, since becoming QRP Labs full-time, I work in my pajamas.
Okay.
So that's my routine, okay?
I think you should continue.
You're welcome.
To each his own.
George and I think, grew up in Southern California at a time when I think, George, you went to the public schools.
Yes.
Right. So the public schools at least in California, had a very large curriculum of industrial arts, electronics, print shops, and all this stuff that if you went through at least the junior high and some of the high school curriculum, you were exposed to a lot of things. Within the last, 30 years, all of these departments were taken out of schools. Do we have a formula for introducing kids now to this mindset that we're talking about right now, where we have, as Hans says, maybe it was our interest in mechanical and electronic things that brought us to ham radio, and it wasn't ham radio that brought us the other way. But do we have a formula, or do we have a secret sauce that we could start applying to the younger generations that could ultimately lead them into the same place where we're all at now?
This is a constant topic of conversation in my household, because my wife's a middle school teacher, and she teaches engineering. So it's part of a rotational program, plus it's an elective. And so in her engineering class, she teaches like microcontroller programming and rocketry and robotics and all that sort of stuff. And so we're constantly saying, what a shame it is that when I was, like you were saying, Eric, when I was in middle school, we had wood shop. You had to take as a boy, you would take wood shop, metal shop, electricity, and drafting. And if you could take print shop if you were taking it as an elective. And that is a super useful set of introductory classes that everybody should take. And it was a shame it was only for the boys. It should have been all the girls as well. So what we've observed in California is that over the decades, all those shop classes, for the most part, have been wiped out. And I don't know if it's because of a liability or what reason they did that, but it's a tragedy. Now, the other thing that you start to see is in the last 10 years is extracurricular activities have stepped up in this area really in two big ways. One is the whole sort of maker movement, I think, has influenced some number of kids, but there still is no formal way to really expose them to that at many schools. The second thing is Dean Kamen, who started the first program, which is all about robotics, has done a phenomenal job of encouraging students across the country and around the world to get into technology and, mostly mechanical, but, there's some electrical and a lot of software. So that's been a phenomenal program. And so schools that are lucky enough to have teachers and programs where they will do these kind of things, their resources are fantastic, but the school districts are not so great at this. And it's very hit and miss in different school districts. So I think we are, as a country, completely missing the boat here. I think it's an absolute crime to not have all the students in middle school and high school somehow take some series of exploratory courses on, practical, hands-on, technical kinds of things. Just like I think when I was taking metal shop, I think the girls took cooking. Well, we never took cooking. They should have made me take cooking. That probably would have been a good thing. I know Pete didn't need that, but the rest of us maybe. So anyway, yeah, I think we're really missing the boat. And as a country, and frankly, in the world, we really need to be upping our game. When I was in high school, computer science was becoming available to high school students. We built an Altair 8800 in my high school math class, which was like the first homebrew 8-bit computer. And these days, the kids all use their phones and they have no idea how the thing works. And we were actually building this and keying in bootloaders with the front panel and writing assembly code as a high school student. We didn't know this was supposed to be hard. We just knew that this was really the cool new thing. And what just shocks me is that more kids in my high school knew how to program than a lot of kids in the current high schools know how to program. And it's, you may know how to put up a website, but that ain't programming. That's 15 layers of software above programming to do a lot of this sort of social media stuff. So, I think we have a real problem. And I think ham radio is one avenue to help, but it's very difficult to get ham radio really used in schools, except for the odd demonstration. So I think it's a problem. I don't really know what the answer is, frankly, but the schools, I think, are missing it out.
Can I add something to this? I have a couple of things to add. So, one of the things which drove probably all the six of us here into ham radio was a specific poverty, right? I mean, you wanted certain things, and there was no question of buying that stuff. So you had to, think of innovating to get to that, right? You had to think of building it. So that poverty is gone. I mean, George was saying that right now, each cell phone has more computing power than probably whole of California in the 1980s. So, given that overload and oversupply of technology and cycles and silicon, there is, engineering is application of science in a budget, right? So you can't build the world's best radio, but you have to build a radio which will cost $100 and see what you can get through with $100. That's what drives Hans to do it. So I think those conditions are rapidly disappearing from kids' lives. So they do not have the creativity in engineering. I mean, I see some of these kids who are so extremely talented with their music, with everything else, but with engineering, very little of it. I keep seeing this stuff on YouTube a lot, and that's actually missing. But on the other hand, the other aspect to ham radio, which brings me to answer the question as to are we equipped to do other things, is that we'd like to be very sovereign with our capabilities, right? So Can I fix my car? Of course, I can fix my car. Can I grow my own food? Probably I'll be able to grow my food. I mean, if I throw myself at it, can I build a house? Probably yes. So I was, someone was telling me, I'm not sure who, probably it's one of you people here, that with his father, they dug out and built a whole house. Sorry, a cousin's husband, Dan, he's actually a librarian in Maryland. I think, Bill dropped me to his place one day. So he says that he and his dad worked for 3 years, every day, 2 hours, digging up the place, making their own bricks, and finally build their own house. So it's that sort of a dedication to being sovereign with your own needs. I think, Eric, in your country, that's actually very valuable even now, right? To be able to be completely sovereign with your own needs. But I think that is a key driver for us hams. So even if we have all the money in the world, are we capable of doing this stuff? I mean, am I capable of making a ventilator sitting up here at home? Or, is Bill capable of making a superhead with whatever stuff he has? Or for example, Pete's pushed limits of what can be done with an Arduino. I mean, I'm not sure that anybody ever thought that Arduino could be made to tap dance that way. But, there we are.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite Ham Radio Workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
I think that there's something about the process. Right now, in this AC, I have to figure out how to get my wife to a swimming pool. It turned out that I have a neighbor that has a swimming pool in her basement, which happens to be a good enough to swim laps in. So one of the things I've taken on the responsibility to do is to understand how to do the chemistry in the pool. And I'm thankful that I actually was required to take chemistry in high school, because with swimming pool chemistry, you're dealing with acids and bases and all kinds of very nasty chemicals that, fortunately, because you're throwing it into 2,400 gallons of water, it's not as bad. But what I'm thinking as I'm doing this is that what ham radio has taught me is the ability to know how to Google the questions in terms of trying to understand, okay, well, how do I keep from hurting myself and the people that are using the pool without any resources? Because right now all of those resources are on vacation, and I'm trying to figure this out myself. So I'm kind of grateful to my education, to my amateur radio background, that when my wife says, oh, you can't possibly do this, how can you understand this? And I say, well, I'm a ham radio operator. Of course I can figure it out. It's on the other end of Google. I just have to know what questions to ask.
Just be grateful she didn't ask you to dig a pool in your basement.
Well, we talked about it yesterday, believe it or not. You never can tell. You could come here at some point, George, and I will have built the pool in the basement.
I have a related thought, Eric. Let me throw something out here that's related to what you just said. I think that is about the importance of sharing what Pete and I have come to call tribal knowledge. We have a lot of experience around this group, all of us. And, when I started struggling building SSB equipment, I kept running across the articles and websites of this guy in California named Pete Juliano, right? And not only his articles, but I came across, I think the first SSB transmitter I made was based on an article that a guy named Frank Lee had published in Sprat, the Journal of the GQRP Club. So I've always kept this in mind. It's really important to take the knowledge that we've gathered and share it with others, not only others who might be interested now, but people who might be interested in these topics 5-10 years from now, off into the future. I think the internet gives us the ability to do that. So that's why I think it's really important and useful for us to do these podcasts, to build these websites, to write these articles, to share this information, because it's going to be out there. So in 5 or 10 years, a kid who right now has no interest in ham radio, if somehow he gets interested in it, he can reach out and Google and find all of the wisdom that Pete Juliano has uploaded to the internet. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, and it makes what we do here kind of in the digital internet area a lot more useful and important than we might think it is.
Let me add a comment to that, Bill. I think that's very applicable to the content itself, but there's also sort of an intangible too, which is that by listening to you and Pete talk about some of your projects, it gives somebody the sort of more confidence that, okay, these guys know more than I do about that, but I don't know, maybe I could try that too. Or gee, maybe it's not just such a black box that I'll never understand. Maybe I have a hope of being able to figure it out. So I think exposure to people with expertise that you can learn from really helps instill more of a sense of confidence in yourself. And you may not do what that other person does, but you may do something similar to that, or you may do something in a similar vein, or however you take the knowledge. But I think having people to look to as role models in that way is really, really important. And so I think that's a whole nother level of what all you guys really contribute to the hobby.
Now, Pete's in his garage. I remember growing up in Southern California, maybe because the weather was nice most of the year, is that the garage doors were open. And while you were working on your projects, and actually that's how I got into amateur radio, there was an open garage door down the street, and the guy was a ham. So, Pete, do you work with your garage door open, and do you have any young people that stray into your garage that you potentially could mentor?
Actually, no, but what is interesting is there's mostly old people on the street. There's very few teenagers, or there's a few young kids. But what is interesting is, like the lady across the street yesterday said, I just wanted to tell you, my grandpa was a ham. And she said, I used to go over there and sit on his lap. And she said, people and everything else. She says, God, that was exciting. She said, I really missed that my father's no longer here. She said, because I'd sit there for hours and he'd be talking to people all over the world. And that's the third person that's told me that on the street. So, there's people that have interest, just think they can't do it. I wanted to share a little story about something that happened 2 hours ago. The friend of Bill and I, Dean, who lives quite close to Bill, took one of my projects that's on the internet, and he's been building it. It's called the Simple SSB, and he started out first with a Michigan Mighty Mite, and then he decided to build this transceiver, and it's only got 10 transistors in it. This morning, he made his first contact on the transceiver, and he's been working on this for about 2 months. He was jumping up and down. I mean, I was excited for him, but he was excited because he made his first contact as something that he entirely built himself. Now, one of the things that he's doing is he has been video recording all the stages that he's gone through with the boards and what have you, and he's making a complete video that he's going to put on YouTube to share with the world. And I think when you have something like this, says, look, I didn't know what I was doing when I started, but, some 2 months later, I now have a complete working transceiver that I've made a contact with. And I was just so excited for him. And I mean, what a buzz. What he was just so excited about this, and that he was able to do this. Now, he spent a lot of time researching, looking up information and what have you. And Bill and I have been kind of sitting with him. He'll send us emails and ask us questions. But I was excited for him. I was excited because he got on the air and got the experience, that joy of someone coming back to him saying, hey, here's your report. I do hear you. And his first QSO was 400 miles away on 40 meters, and he was running 2 watts. So, I mean, this will always be in his mind, his first contact that he's made. And I think it's things like this that, when you share with other people, and I think that's Bill's point, was that the fact that you can record these on YouTube, the other people say, if he can do it, I can do it. So I think there's a lot to that. And another YouTube experience I just wanted to mention is there's a guy, he's had 300,000 views in this. He's a musician, and he had his Fender Strat there, and he's playing it, but he has it into a amp box. And he said, let me change some of the attack times and decay times of this. He said, I'm going to use a 10 nanofarad capacitor, and let's see what happens when I plug that in, and you listen to the sound. I mean, you could really get hooked on that because you were watching him change component values. It said, now, if I make this bigger, here's what happened. If I make it smaller, here's what happens. And I think it's things like this that people start to see and say, hey, this electronic stuff is pretty cool. Then one thing leads to another. And next thing you know, they become a ham.
Bill, you used to talk about your nephew that you built a radio for who potentially could have been a disciple. How did that turn out?
Well, I think this is a problem, and it gets back to what you were talking about in schools. My kids are college age now, so I may be more aware of this. They are under such tremendous pressure in high school to get into the right college that pressure will drive them away from things that they might be interested in, they might find rewarding. It'll also drive them away from courses that might be useful for them later in life, but won't help get them into Stanford. Okay, that's what it comes down to. So my son, for example, took advantage of some of these kind of more practical courses when he was in high school. And he actually, while in high school, became a certified emergency medical technician. They had their own ambulance in the school. They had a registered nurse who trained them on how to treat people in an emergency. It was an extremely useful skill. None of his friends would go into the program. Many of them wanted to. None of them would, because it would not help them get into the college that they wanted to get into. And I think that's the sad reality. And I think that might be what happened with my nephew. Now, he might come back at it later when he has more time and more independence. But right now, the kid is under the gun, like a lot of people his age are. And if the focus is entirely on college admission. It's sad, but it's true, I think.
Well, I think perhaps the reality after college admission and what's happening with schools now might change the result of that.
I have an interesting observation, Eric. All of my life, I got my ham license in 1994. And back then, there was a lot of focus on how do we get young people into amateur radio. And it was observed that all the people who are into amateur radio have all got grey hair or white hair, and they're all likely to die off quickly, and then amateur radio will die because no new young people are getting into it. And of course, I was young at that point, and so I was an exception. And it was true, there were very few young people getting involved, but I think there is more and more hope. And the fact is, amateur radio has not died out. And somehow, despite the fact that some of those white-haired gentlemen are no longer with us, there has been new blood coming into the hobby. And I think there's a lot of hope in the fact that nowadays there are so many venues to share information online with Facebook groups, YouTube videos, web pages, forums, discussion groups, so many possible ways that people could get involved and get interested and really find out about the hobby. And one of the interesting things that I find when we have visitors here, we don't have very many radio amateurs in Turkey. I think in the whole country that I heard there were 2,500 radio amateurs, and of course many of those will be in the large cities of Ankara, Istanbul, and so on. And I only know one radio amateur who lives anywhere near here, and there's no radio clubs or anything like that. Probably in the big cities there are, but not around here. So we get people come to visit who have no idea what ham radio is about, and my wife likes to bring them up here to the lab, shack, office, however you want to call it, and for me to show them what QRP Labs is doing, and of course they want to know what do you do with ham radio and what is it and what kind of things can you do. So I tell them about digital modes and CW and voice modes. And one of the things which they're most surprised about, I think probably would have been less surprising a few decades ago, is that nobody cares about being able to speak to somebody on the other side of the world, because everyone can do that with their mobile phone instantly, and it costs nothing usually, or no incremental cost. So that isn't impressive to people. But when you tell them that there's no internet involved, no satellites involved, no cables involved at all, people that's when they say, wow. And it seems to me that nowadays people have less connection with radio than they did a few decades ago, because these days a lot of us don't get our TV by radio. It comes via cable, and we get most of our entertainment via the internet. We have most of our communications by mobile phones, and everybody knows that there's towers everywhere and the communication range is quite short. When you tell people that you can communicate with someone in America or Japan or UK or Finland or all of these places just by the radio with no internet, no satellites, nothing else, just pure point to point, that's when people get really impressed. And so perhaps there's an opportunity there in that, we used to say, well, now the internet is here and nobody cares about being able to speak to anybody at a great distance. But perhaps there's an opportunity there that now people have perhaps forgotten a bit about what radio is, because shortwave broadcasting, medium wave broadcasting, people don't really listen to so much anymore. They're all getting all of their entertainment on the internet. So perhaps there's an opportunity there now that people can feel some excitement again about amateur radio and indeed find that an avenue to more technical expertise and technical interests, which could lead them into a technical type of career too.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Han's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Are any of you guys taking gear out into the field, at least into the public sphere where people can actually see ham radio in operation, even the stuff you built?
We did that a couple of months ago. We were working on this club radio trailer project where we got a 10 by 6 foot trailer, and we've finished it off inside and installed radios and batteries and stuff. And so we took it on its first and only dry run because now it's quarantined in a storage facility. But anyway, we took it to the local park and set up, and about 7 or 8 club members kind of showed up, and we were messing around making some contacts, mostly CW as it turns out. And a whole bunch of people came by who were just in the parking lot going on a hike. They came by, and some people asked, well, what is this? And you'd explain it. Oh, that's interesting. And at least 2 or 3 people came by who either were hams or their family member, like their parent was a ham. So there is, it always sparks interest. When we've done field days in public spaces, we always get a lot of people that come by and are interested in, you get the whole spectrum from hams to non-hams and people who have their license who haven't been active. So getting out and doing some kind of informal event is always a good thing to kind of help spread the word a little bit. I don't know if anything ever really comes of that necessarily, but I think it's a net positive thing, of course, to try.
Oh, I would connect it back to what Pete was saying about the enthusiasm that our friend Dean had for building his own rig. I think for many of us, one of the things that attracted us to ham radio was that it was a challenge. It was difficult. It was not something that everyone could do. It was not something that you could get into just by pulling out a credit card and buying this kind of radio, So I noticed that there is kind of in the YouTube world, especially the YouTube world, an interest in people, especially younger people, making and building things. And I've been putting some of this stuff up on the Solder Smoke blog, even though it's very, very loosely connected to radio. There's a young Englishman in Washington State who's building this crazy ship. And it's just fascinating to watch him do it. I was watching this morning, there's a fellow named Tariq out in Southern California who is attempting to drop a glider from a balloon at 18,000 feet and have it return to base autonomously. There's this interest in people who are able to take things and take a knowledge and take the skill in their hands and build something. And I don't know, I think that might be something that if people saw it, they would be interested and want to get more involved in. And of course, we are putting it in this public sphere when we put it on YouTube, when we put it out where people can find it. And all the time, we have people stumble across it and say, wow, I never even knew about ham radio, but it was really interesting to see you build that thing. Wow. So I think we have to be a little bit easier on ourselves and realize that even on the internet, we are kind of taking it into the public square.
As podcasters and public figures in amateur radio, which I think probably all of us here are to some degree, is there something that we're not doing that we should be doing? Is there something that would improve our game, perhaps, to make us better than we are at what we're doing?
Can I just, add some of my own experience, which might actually answer Eric's question partly? At my ham radio club, the Lamakan Amateur Radio Club here, we actually do a fair bit of evangelizing, so to speak. And the centerpiece of that is a talk that I give now, which I now know by rote, on how to build a CubeSat. So it basically, talks about the challenges of building a CubeSat, the power budget, the challenges of putting some electronics into space, etc., etc. So we do this for about 40 minutes. And we usually do this at colleges, undergraduate level colleges, because, once you're an undergraduate, that's when you have a lot of time on your hand, right, to indulge in stuff like this. So we do that, and then we give a demonstration of one of the easy sats, right? So you have a handheld dual band Yagi connected to actually a semi-homebrew radio. Probably I have one of them here. It's made with these Dorji modules, a UHF and a VHF radio controlled by an Arduino. So that actually gives them a wow moment, much like what Hans has been talking about, which is to say that we are completely sovereign with our communication needs. And then what we do is we leave it back saying that, if you guys are interested in getting to this, building spacecrafts, talking to people across the world, etc., on your own and building your own gear, the start is to do a ham radio station. And we actually gift them a micro BITX to basically seed a station in their college. It doesn't work all the time. 50% of the time, nobody ever uses the radio. But nevertheless, we do donate a dipole and a radio. And some of the staff, and what happens often is that because there's a continuous churn of these undergraduate kids, every 4 years, some are going in and others are coming in. It's the staff that you have to engage with. If one of the professors becomes a radio ham, then that person, she or he hangs on to a bunch of kids and they start doing stuff. So actually college is probably one of the places where you can catch hold of them. And the other thing is that I see a lot of people in India, what are called as the B towns, that's the smaller towns, being interested in this. Because in big towns, now there's so many incredible number of things to do. But in the smaller towns, they're still not, they don't have as much access to technology as the big towns have. I mean, there are no big component shops. There isn't too much of the tribe to, instill the tribal language into you. So I see a lot of interest coming in from the B towns, rather more interest coming from B towns than the big towns. And the third thing is that a lot of people walk into a club saying that, I've always wanted to be a ham, but I never found time. But now I've turned 50 and now is the time for me to indulge in this. So I see a lot of people in their 50s coming back and expressing desire to become a radio ham. So I think that's a group that we are usually not looking at, which is people who've always wanted to be a radio ham, but have never gotten the time to do it. But now they have the time to do it.
I think several people have mentioned this kind of people coming at it later than we expected. I think Hans talked about that, what Farhan just said. You know, I frankly am kind of skeptical about efforts designed to encourage teenagers to get into ham radio, because I found that it's almost impossible to get teenagers to do anything that they don't want to do, right? And so if the spark is not there, if they don't want to do it, us having a meeting and presenting and encouraging and cajoling and recruiting, you know, nobody recruited me, and I don't think anybody recruited any of you, but we got into it because we became interested in it. So I try to keep that in mind when trying to evaluating whether we should be going out trying to recruit people. And I mean, nobody's out there recruiting people for stamp collecting. You know.
Yeah, I want to chime in on your comment, Bill. I think this is it. I hadn't quite formulated it that clearly, but I'm all for trying to get young people to get their license, and we should do whatever we could do to help that happen if they're interested. And I think that the key is if, and I think it's in a way more important to try to find the people who have a natural interest in trying to want to get into this rather than convincing every single person they should do it. Because I don't think every single person should do it. I think people should do it if there's some magical way to know that at the end of the day they would like it, that's great. And it does take a bit of a process of discovery to figure out if you like it or not. So how do you know unless you get exposed to it? So it's a bit of a challenge there. But I think to your question, Eric, keying off what Bill said, I think we could do a better job of recruiting people in places where they're more likely to be recruited from. And Ashhar, same comment, you know, people who are maybe in their 50s, or, you know, as soon as your kids go off to college, you are a ripe target. So, you know, I think we all face the same thing where, you know, gee, now we don't have to spend every waking hour carting the kids around and doing all that stuff. And now there's time to actually be a little more selfish and do a few things for our own education and enjoyment. So that's the key thing. Now, a lot of people, of course, are in the midst of their career, and there may or may not be the time even still. Right. But I think that's where, you know, I've seen in our club both young people who are like the maker type DIY sort of, you know, college student age get involved. And then also a lot of guys who are, you know, like you said, Bill, 50, and I'm looking for something to do. And I remember something about that ham radio thing. So I don't know how we actually reach out to people like that. I think the podcasting and the YouTube videos are a huge help. But beyond that, I'm not exactly sure. But I do think that that's really the happy hunting ground for new hams.
I mean, you look at Farhan's magazine. He mentioned the club he has, and I have their magazine here. And it's really striking when you look through it, how many young kind of college age, grad school age people are writing articles and involved kind of at the cutting edge of ham radio and technology. I told Pete, I was really jealous when I read your magazine here, Farhan. I mean, I wish there were similar communities here.
Well, I think in North America, you know, it's such a large country, and there's so many clubs that there are some clubs that are doing it really well, and there are some clubs that are not doing it at all. I think I've said this on the podcast a few times, and that is that this week I even asked the question, you know, is 60 still the new 40?
Let's hope so.
We're hoping so. I don't think it's a loss at all that when we have that the average age of a new ham is between 35 and 50. The fact was, when we were growing up, the average life expectancy was 67 years old. At least here in Israel now, we're at 81, 82. So a person who comes into ham radio at 50 years of age has, on the average, about 30 years of good ham radio operation ahead of them. So maybe the 35-year-olds are the kids who are coming in. They have money to spend. They may have some time. I don't know, Hans, you can say whether or not, well, you have time because you're in your lab, but maybe 35 are the new teenagers. And so we should be looking for professionals who are settled, who have a little bit of money to spend, who may have some time, and they need to figure out how to spend hours away from the television.
I think it's a very good point, and perhaps explains the observation that I made. You know, back in 1994 when I got my license, everyone was saying ham radio will die out because nobody young is coming into it, but it hasn't. And that was probably, as you said, you know, because the people in the 50s are the majority of the people signing up for it. So, maybe people are looking in the wrong place.
We have high expectations, and besides, our kids are still living with us for some reason.
But I think, another point is people have their careers. And I certainly remember at the beginning of my career, 70-hour working weeks were quite normal. And life, you're having kids, you're concentrating on a very demanding career. I'm sure life kind of settled down a bit, and people do have more time as the decades roll on, and indeed more money left over to spend on a hobby.
I'll throw in one more thought there, if I might, on attracting people, and that is that we have to make sure that we don't try to enforce on new hams or prospective hams the things that we like to do. And I think some of that is good, but I think you really need to listen to what intrigued the person that showed up at the club meeting. The biggest turnoff is that when you show up to a club meeting and you don't know anybody or anything, and if you're not interested in what all the old guys are interested in, then you feel kind of like it's not your place. So one of the things we really try to do in our club is to understand, what do the new members or prospective hams find intriguing? And even if it's not what you like to do, try to figure out how to help them do that thing. So, and a lot of the things are like, I have a hotspot and a DMR radio, and the old farts are going to say, well, that's not real ham radio. But if that's what the new ham wants to do, then do it yourself. Encourage them and sort of help guide them down that path. And the funny thing is, at some point, a lot of them are going to wind up saying, I really want to learn CW now. How do I do that? So, you're not going to lose them. You're actually going to hook them. And then you'll get a chance later to expand their horizon a bit. So I think we really have to listen to what newcomers are intrigued by.
Yeah. I'd just like to add one more thing, which probably is nothing to do with ham radio particularly, but it applies to ham radio in a big way, which is this, that Eric was talking about the increasing lifespans, right? Now, what happens is that most of the engineers just finish the undergrad and start working. So their formal education is about 4 years, which lasts them for a career worth 25 years, right? Another 25 years. So in their 50s, they've been kicked upstairs and they're into managerial positions, and they're no longer really doing an engineering work. But the point is that you still have an active life of at least into your 70s. I mean, we all here are expecting ourselves to be really active, up into our 70s, even probably running marathons by then. So what do you do, halfway through, on the halfway mark, into your 50s, to up your skills once more? That, I think, is a key question that, the generation surrounding me, plus minus 10 years, will have to answer for themselves. And we have to, in a lot of ways, go back to college. We'll have to relearn to learn again and pick up new skills. And that's what I think, ham radio brings us into, that we are self-learners. I mean, 3 years ago, I knew zilch about building satellites, and then you get into it and then you build it. 2.5 years ago, Hans, just declared one day that I'm going to build an SDR, and he gets onto this project and finishes the entire thing off. So these are the skills which are more and more required for engineers, and that's what I see in our club station. For example, there's this guy who just walked in one day and said that I work at Qualcomm, and all day I run simulations of microwave stuff on my computer. So I heard that you guys build stuff. So I said, yeah, we do build stuff. And there's this Ashhar satellite, which, people who are in Europe and, outside the US know about, which is a 2.4 gigs up and 10 gigs down. And this guy just got onto that project, very much like George was saying. He came in there because he wanted to do microwaves with his hands. And then he learned to cut strip lines with a kitchen knife. And he started building this stuff, and he's actually built a full transmitter for 2.4 gigs up from HF2, up. And I think the entire thing just cost about $20 because he knew the consumer electronics parts. He knew which part can give 2.4 gigs, 2 watts out, how do you make a mixer, which are the cheapest diodes available. So, I was really struck by Srinidhi because he had never, on his part encountered this bravado of saying, why don't I just make it on my kitchen table rather than have a $10 million lab at your disposal. On the other hand, I had never encountered anybody with such microwave skills, completely theoretical, who had never ever, actually seen a piece of microwave work. So it was a very interesting encounter. And I'm glad that, he's part of our gang now. But that's the point that I was trying to make, which is, into your 50s, a lot of people will want to up their skills, and not just professionally, but, what do you do with your life? I mean, your professional career will end in a couple of years, and you need to keep yourself engaged from getting old.
I think you really gave me an interesting thought too, which is most of us, when we go to school to learn a discipline. So we become electrical engineers and learn hardware. We become software engineers and learn software or mechanical engineering. And what ham radio can do for you is give you an opportunity to sandbox and play in the disciplines that you weren't trained in. So there's a lot of guys who were, mechanical engineers who learned to write software because they had an Arduino to control some mechanical thing. And the skill set that's really required today, even for a new college grad, a lot of companies really look for diverse skill sets. So just because you're a mechanical engineer, you're still expected to know how to write Python. It's not good enough to be just an expert in one domain. You have to have some diversity, and if you don't, you're going to be at a disadvantage because the students coming out of college with more hands-on practical experience and also more cross-disciplinary exposure are going to be more successful. And I think that extends all the way up through the career. So, maybe this becomes kind of a opportunity for people to learn other things where they didn't perhaps have that formal education.
Do you guys have some parting shots for my audience in terms of what they should be doing or looking for in ham radio going forward in order to enrich their lives and to survive AC?
I would just say, Eric, that I think this crisis could be just sort of a warning shot. It's as bad as it was, it could be a lot worse. And having the kind of skills that you develop in a workshop, being able to make things, being able to repair things, being able to innovate and create a ventilator or something similar to what Farhan did or what Hans does or what everybody here does, these are valuable skills that could be really useful in emergency. Beyond that, one of the things that we have to think about with ham radio is the social aspect of it. As technically oriented as most of us are, this is all this gear allows us to communicate with other people. For a lot of us, it was the reason we got into it, was to overcome social awkwardness as adolescents, right? But it does create this opportunity to reach out and talk to people, even in quarantine, even when you're in lockdown. So I think those are useful things to keep in mind as we consider how to operate post-crisis.
I think every amateur radio repeater across the world is busier now than it's been in the last 30 years as a result of the local hams getting together and finding out what's new. P. Juliano, you've been kind of quiet there in the back. What parting shot would you give to the QSO Today audience today?
I was thinking about that, and I'm going to come out with my mantra. The last thing to do is turn on the soldering iron. And, the year 2020 is so exciting in terms of the tech. There's so much out there that after the coronavirus, AC, it's cheap and it's inexpensive. And I think what you need to do is invest the time to learn about it. I think the point that was just being discussed here the last several minutes was you need to learn about this stuff. And once you learn it, it just opens up a whole new world. So last thing to do is don't turn on the soldering iron about all this new technology and how it can be implemented. Touch panel screens on your radio. We used to think of a knob or a dial. We have frequency stability we could only dream of. And in a microcontroller that has all this functionality that lets us do all kinds of things. So it's just an amazing time, but we need to spend some of the time learning about it and expanding our knowledge.
Before turning the soldering iron on,
Yes. Yes.
Before we go, do you guys still use lead in your solder?
Yeah,
Yes.
works much better.
That's the only thing that works.
Just try not to eat it.
I took a project today to prototypes that I'm building for a medical project to an assembler. And as I'm walking, she shows me 2 rolls of solder. She says, lead or unleaded? And I said, well, if I was building it, I would use the lead. And she says, good choice. So, Hans, do you have some parting shots?
I would say one of the things that this crisis has made me think about is, not exactly put myself in a prepper type of category, but to think about what would happen and where our skills would be valuable if we lose our infrastructure, our communications infrastructure, due to natural disasters, due to war, due to some enormous crisis that puts a large number of people out of action. This crisis has made me think a little bit more about that and think a little bit more about having ready some means of communication like batteries charged, a portable setup that could be used in those sort of circumstances. And perhaps that's something that people want to think more about after this crisis, AC, having a little bit, because many of us have our shack and all our radios around us, and this is where we sit and we do our stuff. I personally, how many times have I operated portable somewhere? Very rarely, and a long time ago. And I have nothing here ready that if I needed to operate portable or in emergencies, if I had no grid power, I would not be able to do anything right now. My amateur radio skills would be useless at this moment if I had no grid power. So that's something I think perhaps we should all think about a bit more, how we could make ourselves ready. Not over ready, not going panicking about it, but just think about it a little bit.
Bill?
I have my micro Bidex right here, ready to go, with portable power, a microphone, a key, and everything. I thank Farhan for that. So I agree with Hans.
In a tea box or something like that, right?
Cigar box, yeah.
Ashhar?
I think the most important thing here is that it's given us a pause. And a lot of us are getting back to our hobbies in a very different way, with a different time scale to it. I mean, for instance, now we are thinking of doing projects, where we could put about 3 to 4 hours at once, per day on a continuous basis, etc. So I think a lot of changes in our emotional makeup as makers during this lockdown will continue, and I hope it does continue, where we take things a little more easier and be gentler on ourselves, both in and out of the shack. I think that's actually given us a lot of time to introspect about the life-work radio balance. And I think that's the big learning for me now, that I'm no longer racing around to get things done. I'm taking it easy, and I like it this way. There was an undue haste in everything that we were doing for a long time.
George, I think you're the last guy there. Last man standing, George.
Wow, that means I need to say something smart. So let me set your expectations low. The thing that just strikes me is something that everybody here does is spend a significant amount of time and effort to help other people. And I think as hams, the ham radio hobby is probably about one of the most open and giving and sharing that I can imagine. And we all have people who helped us get to where we are. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to spend some time to help everybody else. And so that doesn't mean you necessarily have to have a podcast or run a de-expedition or something. But I think as hams, we could all set at least one goal maybe for the coming year of what could we do to kind of help our ham radio community, whatever way that motivates you. If it's to design something or build something or help out at a club event or write an article or encourage your neighbor to get his ticket, whatever that happens to be. Like Ashhar, I think your points about being all too terribly busy is very spot on. So maybe if everybody could just take a few hours and just help someone else out in the hobby learn something, encourage someone, I think that would be fantastic. And we have such an amazing network of people to take advantage of too, to help out. So I'd just like to see that.
Well, I think we've all discovered, at least by social distancing and maybe being at home for the last few weeks, that we can actually make the time if we want to make the time in order to clear a spot to help somebody else. Gentlemen, I can't tell you what a thrill it is for me to spend episode 300 with all of you. And I thank you so much for joining me. And I want to wish you 73. And thanks so much.
Congratulations, Eric.
Thanks, Eric. Congratulations.
Happy 300.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with the panel. Be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and look at panel discussion in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item on the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Radio Expo. I'm updating it as I have more information, so the page is live. My thanks to both ICOM America and to QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages and by using QSO Today in the coupon box at checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Stitcher, iTunes Store, and a whole host of other podcast and audio information providers. There's a list of links to them on the right side of the show notes pages. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media, Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.